Hello, everybody. Welcome. I think it's probably about time to get started. We still have some people joining, but we'll be letting them in. I don't want to waste any of your time. So just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. The first is that this session will be recorded, just so you know. And the second is that because it's quite a tight session and we're going to be sticking as closely as we can to the hour that's been allotted, we're going to probably not have a huge amount of time for Q&A at the end. So if you do have questions, please enter them into the chat box. You will see that there, and we will try and get to them during the course of the call if we possibly can. And if for whatever reason we can't get to them, we'll be following up with answers, very specific answers from our guests as appropriate. So please direct any questions, whether they're general questions or specific questions, to any of our speakers in the chat box. And if we can't get to it in the call, we'll certainly get to it afterwards through LinkedIn and various other channels. So without further ado, let's get started. Richard, over to you.
Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this session on energizing agriculture in the Global South. My name is Richard Harris, and I'm the CEO for Smart Power Myanmar, which has commissioned this study into the role of value chains and promoting innovative finance and energy investments in agricultural value chains, primarily in the context of distributed rural electrification. We're primarily funded by the Rockefeller Foundation that has supported this study and is, of course, involved in a number of different projects around the world focused on problems such as these. This is the third in a series of three, so the final event where we're trying to share to as many people as possible some of the insights that this study brought forth, but also invite to the stage groups of speakers who we're very fortunate to have been able to convince and entice to sit with us over 3 days to talk about their own thinking and their own experiences around the role of value chains in the promotion and scale up of decentralized rural electrification. We've, as of today, we've had in excess of 200 participants and 11 different speakers who have joined us, which is fantastic. And I just want to say a few words before I hand over back to Sam, who is going to be the MC of today's event and to engage with our speakers. But just to give you a little bit of context about the origin of this study and what we're thinking. The idea behind the study and these events is really to take a closer look at access to energy in the context of complex value chains. And that's born from a desire to leverage more complementary investments in agriculture and electricity based on our experience that this is the only way to create sustainable, scaled, distributed rural electrification. And so that is also born from our own understanding, and some of this came out very strongly from the study, that investors beyond subsidies will want to see successful bankable business models. And of course, these bankable models will depend on the productive use of electricity. But those productive use initiatives or businesses will in turn depend on thriving value chains. And our conviction is that it's those value chains that are poorly understood, poorly invested in, and not sufficiently integrated into energy access planning. So really the trigger for us here is understanding value chain linkages and as the missing piece. And that was really the genesis for all of this. And of course, while the study was conducted in one particular country, we're not going to focus on that particular country. We want to try to ask those questions for what's often known as the Global South. So we've got speakers and participants from all over the world, majority from African countries, which is just tremendous. The research itself was conducted by TFE, who will be emceeing today. And the vast majority of what we're going to hear today is around the problem of who pays and exploring this. And we're extremely lucky to have Deepak Goel from the Shell Foundation. He's the regional director for India for the Shell Foundation, and Tombo Banda from CrossBoundary Energy Access, Raluca Golumbeanu from the World Bank SMAP, and Kumbirai Makanza from the Rural Futures Fund, who are all going to share their wisdom and their insights into different aspects of the financing problem for this space. So with no further ado, let me hand back to Sam Doobie, who will be your MC for the day. And over to you, Sam.
Thank you, Richard. So if there's one thing I've learned, one major lesson I've learned through the course of this work on the energy agricultural nexus is that whilst the decision makers trying to come up with solutions to the various challenges are traditionally very siloed, with high-level agricultural strategizing being done in a very different building from the energy infrastructure planning. For the people on the ground, it really is all part of the same set of challenges. If I'm a smallholder farmer, improved agricultural practices and better access to energy are both simply enablers for me to claw my way out of poverty and or improve living conditions for me, my family, and my wider community. But this is not just the case for smallholder farmers. The need for better access to affordable energy, better access to affordable finance are common across the entire value chain spectrum, from off-grid rural communities right down to large-scale on-grid agricultural processes. Whether it is finance for more storage space and better equipment, or cheaper, more reliable energy to run existing equipment, time and time again during the course of this research, these things came up. The two biggest barriers in the way of improved incomes for actors all the way along agricultural value chains were a lack of finance to start or expand their businesses and a lack of affordable and reliable energy in order to power them. Now, this is all very good, but where does the money to achieve all this, to solve these problems, come from? In other words, who pays? Now, during the course of this research, two things became abundantly clear. Number one, different things need to be paid for with different types of capital. And number two, the wrong people are currently paying for the wrong things. Now, this means that what capital is available is not being used efficiently or wisely. Upstream, at the community level, this means that standalone equipment suppliers and mini-grid developers have a vertical integration problem. They're having to do almost everything themselves. They're having to do market research and find sites themselves. It's nearly impossible for them to find affordable, good local capital. They're expected to undertake demand stimulation, provide appliance leasing, productive use support. They have to use their own equity to build sites, and they have to take on a significant amount of risk themselves. Downstream, on an on-grid factory, where the owner wants to smooth his electricity supply with a solar backup system, there is also a very significant problem with risk. The owners of the factory themselves don't have the technical capacity to know what kind of system they need. There's a shortage of credible suppliers. They don't have enough capital themselves anyway, which is not surprising really, because buying a 20-year supply of electricity upfront is an enormously expensive thing to do. Local financiers who could be able to help them are simply not able to. They don't have the capacity. They don't understand these kind of investments. And regulations are largely unsupportive. For example, if there was a clear feed-in tariff, it would mean that any energy surplus from the system could be sold back into the grid, which would make the investment less risky. Now, all of these are very big and very different challenges. So how does one even begin to address them? So if I could distill the findings of our report into two simple, if somewhat paradoxical lessons, it would be these. Number one, in some ways, investments into energy at different points of agricultural value chains, upstream or downstream, are the same. Number two, in some ways, they're very, very, very different. So let's start with the differences. The first is an obvious one. Certain agricultural processes only make sense at scale, whereas rice threshing or maize grinding might be suitable at a small community scale. Cotton yarn spinning needs high throughput in order to justify the required investment. Therefore, it's only really suitable downstream where large quantities of agricultural output can be aggregated. Secondly, upstream, investments are that much closer to low-income recipients. Whereas keeping the machines of a cotton factory humming and revenues up will affect the factory owners, and hopefully the workers too, there is less immediately obvious direct social impact. In comparison, investing in a rice thresher in a small mini-grid powered community will allow the local farmers to capture more value locally, which will have an immediate and crucially, an easily measurable direct and indirect impact. And the easily measurable bit here is key, particularly when we start talking about donor finance. Now, there are other differences like risk profile and exposure to different regulations, but I'll leave it there for now. Now, let's talk about the similarities. So the first, and this is particularly true for captive power and mini-grid systems, is that the CapEx financing needs are very similar. Now, this is not currently the way things are done, but in an efficient and optimized finance world, both mini-grids and captive power systems will be built using local construction finance. And once built, both could very easily be refinanced, at least in part, using similar sources of commercial capital. And we'll touch on this a little bit later. The second similarity is that both from a technical operation perspective and a financial performance perspective, these small scale and large scale projects both produce exactly the same kind of data. In this case, data becomes the great equalizer, and energy investments up and down the value chain, from upstream community level investments all the way downstream urban factory level investments, can be compared in an apples to apples manner. Now, the implications for this are multifold. For example, if they can be compared, they can arguably be bundled together. And if they can be bundled together, they can be assembled into larger investable portfolios. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. So what we're seeing on the ground, just to summarize, is that investments at different points of agricultural value chains have some things in common and some points at which they're different. However, it's important to note that there are also financing needs at an even higher level than this. And often these are concerned with the creation of enabling environments, without which none of what we've been talking about today would even be possible. So our last session was dedicated to enabling environments and the technical details about how best to create them. But what we did not go into was who should be paying for this kind of high-level ecosystem development. Arguably, it's the national and the international stakeholders who should be doing this. Now, very few stakeholders have as much of a high-level and global mandate than the World Bank. We're very fortunate today to have Raluca from the World Bank and the SMAP team with us. Raluca, in my view, much of the role of stakeholders like the World Bank when it comes to energy access is to incubate the sector until there's enough momentum for it to stand on its own 2 feet. I see this as taking the form of providing technical assistance to local lending institutions or providing in-country finance windows to promote productive uses of energy, for example. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how you view the role of organizations like the World Bank and like SMAP, and what stakeholders like this should be paying for in the ecosystem. Raluca, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sam. Thank you very much for this invitation. I will be very happy to share a few practices on promoting productive uses that have been designed and implemented by the World Bank. So, as you know, the World Bank is ramping up the energy access programs, and as part of these programs, the productive use stimulation has been prioritized to enhance the socio-economic impact. We all know that productive use stimulation will ensure income generation, job creation, skills development in targeted communities. We also have, specific activities targeting vulnerable groups like female-headed business. But it's also equally important for the service providers, either utility, mini-grid developers, agri-solar companies, in order to ensure the financial viability of the project. However, the productive use stimulation requires building complex ecosystems, including, as you well mentioned, data analytics, value chain assessments, planning, public awareness campaigns, business development support, availability and affordability of appliances, access to finance, market linkages, among others, so-called, we call them building blocks. The World Bank, through its global practices, it can be agriculture, water, energy, social development, finance, aims to address these building blocks for productive use of electricity ecosystems development, also building partnership with client governments, development organization, and local NGOs. Prioritization of investments depend in principle on data analytics, value chain assessment, socioeconomic impact on the communities, overall business environment, and complementarity with the entry points brought by other internal or external interventions. And I'll give a few examples going through different technologies. On the grid side, the World Bank financed productive use stimulation activities in Peru and Indonesia. And the interventions targeted basically marketing campaign pursued by local NGOs to support national utilities, connect business, in addition to business development support provided to the local SMEs based on SWOT analysis. While these marketing campaigns pursued by local NGOs eventually resulted in an increase of sales by the national utilities, one of the key lessons from this project was related to the need for prioritization of these efforts, of these market efforts underpinned by market intelligence, by data analytics. Definitely, when we are talking about grid electricity and productive uses, pricing and reliability of supply are preconditions for productive use stimulation. If we focus more on sub-Saharan Africa, since access to finance for SMEs, distributors of appliances and users is much more constrained compared to Peru and Indonesia, a more comprehensive approach is envisaged for utilities, for example, in Niger, that we plan on the bill financing of appliances, along with coordination with other global practices on the prioritization of investments. On the mini-grid technology, so the mini-grid site selection should be driven by productive loads. In Mali, Nigeria, we try to collocate mini-grid investments with the investments pursued by agriculture and water colleagues in mining projects, as well as we try to leverage the geospatial data on potential agricultural loads in order to ensure the preconditions for financial sustainability of the mini-grids. However, the reality on the ground shows that overall mini-grids have been largely driven by social inclusion agenda, which basically is reflecting poor performance of the projects in terms of financial viability. And in this case, systematic efforts to stimulate productive uses are required. Similar to those that I mentioned in the case of the grid, simulation of practice for the grid, including marketing, access to finance, business development, support, along with tariff incentives, promotional price, daytime use. So basically, a complexity of interventions need to be implemented to stimulate the productive use. On the off-grid solar, we design our intervention based on market intelligence, supply and demand analysis, in order basically to inform the productive use interventions. The energy access project financing windows, such as RBF grants, credit lines that will facilitate access to debt financing, technical assistance are envisaged to promote, to be leveraged to promote productive use in the off-grid solar space, along with the promotion of the pay-go technologies and business model that will ensure access of end user to finance. Complementarity with other intervention is critical to ensure sustainable business model. And I will give the example of Bangladesh and Rwanda. Both in Bangladesh and Rwanda, we had financing windows. In Bangladesh, basically, the solar irrigation program built on the successful solar home system program, leveraging credit lines, results-based financing and technical assistance provided by the implementing agency by ITCOL. The same in Rwanda, basically the agriculture, global practice finance, cold chain development. So basically solarization of cold chain development along the value chain. That being said, one of the key challenges faced by both projects were basically related to market linkages. So the uptake of the agriculture output was not envisaged as planned. So as a result, significant technical assistance to build these market linkages and to create business development support across the value chain has been provided to the projects to ensure sustainable business models. So my point is that access to finance is one of the building blocks, but definitely, as you rightly mentioned, it needs to be assessed in a more holistic, comprehensive approach that will ensure sustainable business models, which definitely includes market linkages. So to sum up, the prioritization of investments should depend on data analytics, on overall business environment, enabling environment, and the entry points provided by other global practices, other partners, so existing financing windows within the investment projects in order to address the entire ecosystem of the productive use. Most importantly, understanding the realities on the ground, learning from programs designed and implemented by other programs, either nationally financed or financed by international donors. These are activities that are supported and are the core of the SMAP Improving Livelihoods and Human Capital Development Initiative that basically aims at promoting productive use of electricity within the World Bank Energy Access Programs. Thank you.
Wow, Raluca, thank you. There was so many things that interesting stubs to pick up on, but I was really interested in some of the phrases that you're using. You were talking about market linkages, you were talking about complementarities. For me, all of those are words which describe the fact that it's a complex system. Nothing exists in isolation. And I think for so long, a lot of the talk around particularly productive uses has been a very isolated type of conversation. It's how much does this machine cost and can we get it into this village, rather than considering that it is part of a much bigger system, which is needing the inputs of enough agricultural produce and the market linkages, as you say, to offload any of that surplus into the market and therefore bring some income into the village. So it's really interesting to hear that your process and your strategy is dealing with that complexity, and it's a really very complex problem. And I think that actually we have Deepak from the Shell Foundation here. I know that Shell Foundation are also ecosystem enablers in this way, in the sense that they offer support right across the spectrum, from consumer finance at one level, working with mini-grid project developers to grow the demand on sites, all the way through to quite interesting and innovative ways to use de-risking capital in order to crowd any more commercial investment into the space. And I think that that word de-risking is a really interesting one, because the role of a lot of these ecosystem enablers seems to be about de-risking. So I'm really curious, Deepak, to hear from you about how you see that de-risking requirement, or that reliance on de-risking capital in the sector to be able to, for the sector to be able to wean itself off. What do you think might need to be in place for the sector in order for there to be less of a reliance on that? Can you speak into that a little bit, Deepak?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Hello, everyone. Happy to actually speak about this, and I do agree with what you said and other speakers have mentioned about productive use sector. And I think to reach really, to build up the concept, to reach really millions of people, we need to use a de-risking capital, which is not available in abundance, in a much more efficient way to actually leverage much higher volumes of commercial capital that we are doing now. I think only then we will be able to achieve or closer to the targets that we have for productive use appliances, right? I think if you look at it, currently significant amount of de-risking capital is required by investors due to perception of high risk. And this perception of high risk actually comes from early stage nature of the sector, as being spoken by speakers in this, policy and regulatory risk. As far as I'm aware, there is no concrete policy in any country about DRE productive use appliances, how to support them. But more importantly, I think these two things are aware. More importantly, there's a lack of data on track record and performance history of new technologies. I mean, let's accept productive use technologies. We are not saying we can use what is being existing for last 100 years. What we are saying is that for them to be mini-grid compatible, we need to have more efficient, fit for purpose, new technologies, right? To make sense for these productive use technologies. There's a risk, inherent risk in the technology. There's a business model risk, but also there's a risk, or there's a lack of data in understanding need of consumer itself, right? We do make a lot of hypotheses when we do projects, when we do pilots on ground, and lot more often than not, all those hypotheses are not correct. We capture them, but in silos. We don't share them in a more concrete manner with the ecosystem that can help us actually collate data and design a better product and reduce the risk, right? Let me give you an example. I think a few years back, some of you would be aware of that electric three-wheelers is one of the fastest emerging productive use appliance in India. Millions of electric three-wheelers are right now operating in India, particularly North India, flooded by imports from China, right? One of the biggest barriers for EV financing, they're not receiving formal financing, even though technically a productive use asset should have less risk because you earn and you pay your EMI, but they're not receiving formal financing. And one of the biggest reason for that is lead batteries. Most of them operates on lead batteries, and lead batteries have very limited operating life. Within 6 months, your mileage reduced to half, and then you need to replace them in 9 to 12 months, which means that the capacity to pay back EMIs after 9 to 12 months is significantly less and a big risk for a financier, right? Now, we thought if we can provide lithium batteries, which are 4x of capex of lead batteries, cannot be afforded by a rickshaw driver, electric driver, right? This will reduce the risk of payments, and this will also increase income of a driver or asset owner because they can use asset more. Lithium batteries can be charged in 2 hours compared to lead batteries 8 hours, right? And lithium batteries mileage will not reduce over 6 months, right? So theoretically, it makes sense that asset owners can run more earn more, and the lower risk of financiers. We did a very controlled pilot in one of the cities in North India with 50 e-rickshaws, right? While we are right that the mileage is not going down, I think we were a bit surprised to see that the income of asset owner was not going up. They were still still earning the same amount of money, even though they can drive more, than before. And when we explored more, we realized that to drive more, they need to work more. Currently, 80 kilometers from lead batteries was good enough for them for 6 to 8 hours of work. Now, for them to use lithium batteries, for them to earn more, which makes all the practical sense in the world, when you make a desktop design of a project, they need to work for 2 hours more. And their income can really go up by 50% because cost is same. But they were not willing to do that. They said, we are used to 6 to 8 hours of work. We are used to drive 80 kilometers. We don't have an appetite and we don't have a need to earn more and drive more. Right now, that made the project unviable because we could not utilize lithium batteries enough as we modeled them. And this is exactly the type of data which needs to be captured and which needs to be shared with others in the sector. Right. This type of data, I can share more examples, but this type of data would help. If this would have been very positive, this type of data would help reduce the risk premium. We need de-risking capital because it is risky for investors than the conventional sectors. There is no incentive for investors to invest in more risky areas if there's no de-risking capital. So we need to reduce risk premium for investors to start asking for a lower capital. There are two elements of it, as I said. One element is really de-risking the technology, de-risking the business model, for which we need to do a capacity development programs for these entrepreneurs who run systems on ground. But also we need to run capacity development program for lenders, local lenders. They need to be told what are the type of financial instruments, syndications can be used to reduce the risk. We cannot assume that the international practices are well known with local lenders. That hand holding of local lenders initially is very much required and missing in the sector in a big way. TA support for entrepreneurs is there. TA support for farmers is there. But TA support for local lenders is not there. Right. So that's one area to look at. Right, to reduce the de-risking capital so that they're more comfortable with that. And the second area really is what consumer, right, as I mentioned. So what we really need to do, we need to identify, better understand, then quantify, and then evaluate the risk. We need to do all these things for all the stakeholders in the value chain, right? And for this, we need less resource intensive technology and processes that can collect, verify, and analyze the data. We cannot rely on sending people on ground for collecting every piece of data. So we need to develop less, it's very critical, less resource intensive processes to collect reliable, consistent, traceable data. Only then lenders would trust that. Right? Doing a sample sizing of 1% of the population is not going to build trust. Right? And now I think comes the most important part. Risk perception can only be reduced by active knowledge sharing. Data is no good if it is sitting on my laptop. It's useless. Right? Which means we need to have meaningful collaborations in the ecosystem to collect similar type of data that can be compared. There is no point of collecting data by everyone using different definitions and then that cannot be compared. This is what we are doing right now. Every organization has their own set of impact metrics, their own set of financial metrics with slightly different definition, not very different, slightly different definition of how you define carbon mitigation or how you define increase in income, which makes data comparison impossible. So one, we need to harmonize on that we all talk same data, same definition. Second, we need to have a platform to share data in an anonymized manner so that it cannot be used as a competitive edge by one or two people. We need to share data, but we need to also be careful about competition, right? And then we need to have a sector level observations and analysis, right? So in short, if we would like to reduce de-risking capital, requirement of de-risking capital in the market, we need to reduce the risk perception of the sector, and for which we need to more openly share meaningful data in the sector, right? So that's where I will stop. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Deepak. That was really, really interesting. And again, it raises lots of follow-on questions. But I think that what you talk about with data is really interesting. And the actual case study that you mentioned, the fact that you can model everything, do a desktop model, it can sound like the most fantastic example. But when you actually get into the field and test it, for one completely unexpected reason or another, it simply doesn't work. And so I think that the hypothetical design, even if it is data supported, does need to be backed up by practical tests and practical pilots of ideas. And that nicely segues into our next speaker actually on the call, Tombo Banda, because Tombo heads up the CrossBoundary Innovations Lab in Nairobi. And as I understand it, and Tombo, please, can you speak more into this? But as I understand it, the purpose of the Innovations Lab is to do exactly this. It's to test out various innovations on the mini-grid business model and shares that data-supported evidence with developers, with governments and funders to help them make better decisions. I also understand that the lab is working across the stakeholder spectrum, from people like the World Bank, REA Nigeria, CLASP, to build the building blocks to get energy efficient, electric powered income generation machines to market at scale. So this sounds like one of the tests that's been done, and it shows a lot of promise. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about what these building blocks are, and also how you imagine that these building blocks will help with scale, because that is obviously a critical piece of this conversation. Tombo, could you speak a little bit into that?
Sure. Thanks, Sam, and thanks Deepak and Raluca. So I was nodding my head very emphatically when Deepak was speaking, because I think what we consider our building blocks and what Deepak mentioned tie in very well together. And maybe just to note as well that our building blocks per se are different to what the World Bank or ESMAP classes their building blocks. So we at the lab, as you rightly mentioned, Sam, test innovations that make the mini-grid business model more viable, productive use being one of them. And then we see through our prototypes where we test different permutations of appliance financing, gather data, and then share it. We see, three emerging factors to enable us to get energy efficient, electrically powered, income generating machinery to market at scale. And these are, number one, high performing machinery, number two, effective supply chains, and number three, getting flexible financing for the appliances themselves. So on high performing machinery, I think, Deepak's example really touched on what we see on the ground. And, we say that, if we think about on the agricultural side, we need machines that outperform diesel in terms of cost and output in order for there to be scale. And at present, what we see is that, some of this machinery is just not fit for purpose, or it's not competitive for customers. And furthermore, we see that, the manufacturers of this machinery, the large machinery manufacturers of the diesel machinery, for example, have not really shown the willingness to invest in the R&D, to make alternatives or electrically powered agricultural machinery competitive with diesel. We believe that one of the drivers for this inertia could be a general misconception about what the true size of the market is. We believe the lab is producing an innovation insight that we hope to share with the sector soon that shows the one mill can have the effect of improving a mini grid's profitability by 11%. And so if you convert all mills in a typical community of 200 connections, we see 4 typically in such a community. That's 44% increase in the bottom line IRR. So the potential impact for the mini grid developers and on scale for manufacturers is huge, and the opportunity is large. But there is need for actors such as the lab, such as Shaw Foundation, to make sure that we get governments and funders to provide the R&D funding that is required to make sure that these agricultural generating machinery do compete with diesel in terms of cost and output. Speaking from the lab's experience, we see for electric grain mills, for example, often the throughput of electrically powered alternatives is not as high as for diesel. And I think this has been covered in other sessions, but if the tariff is high and then the cost and the throughput is low, it's just suddenly not competitive to run your electrically powered machine. Furthermore, specific customer requirements such as the fineness of flour can be a reason for uptake or lack of uptake. The time taken to get to that fineness is another factor. So we need to make sure that the correct amount of R&D is being spent so that we can provide the data, the analysis, and the information to manufacturers to enable them to design machinery that works in these rural settings and that is competitive. And we very much see this initial investment in the R&D as a catalyst for then the private sector to take over. Having mentioned already the size of the market, we believe that if manufacturers are made aware that this is in their financial interest and they have customers who will take the product because it's cost competitive for them, the private sector takes it from there. So we think that the R&D funding is a significant catalyst that needs to be input into the process as the first fundamental building block before we can achieve scale. The second building block around effective supply chains is, once we have this high-performing machinery, how do we get it to the end user? And here, the lab is working with partners to create linkages between the international suppliers to the local markets and from the local markets to those rural sites. And what we are exploring is really, using multiple channels to do this. So, working with distributors of current diesel-powered agricultural machinery and farming inputs as a source, working with fast-moving consumer goods players, working with third-party logistics providers. How can we make it efficient to get from manufacturer to the rural site? And importantly, once we get it to that site, how do we make sure we're providing those end-to-end services that make the business case sustainable? So are we providing marketing and distribution? Are we providing after-sales services such as maintenance and warranty fulfillment? That will sustain those businesses once they uptake this new machinery that doesn't have those servicing capabilities in the setting where it's being used. So that is, the second building block where we see, a need really to catalyze actors to make those linkages in supply chains. And then, once established, we believe, again, the private sector takes the lead in driving that to scale. Then the final building block that I'll touch upon is the financing for the appliances themselves. So we need machinery financing for the customers. As we know, in many of these rural settings, often the rural customers and the end users cannot afford the new machinery. And, you know, if the mini grid developers are providing the financing themselves, you know, often this is over and above what their core business is, and sometimes they don't have the capability to provide, you know, to structure, you know, financing facilities in-house, and so they may not be, you know, best placed to provide the service. So what we as the lab see as the natural partners here, and again, Deepak mentioned them as a critical stakeholder, is the local MFIs, the local non-banking institutions, the local saving and credit cooperative organizations, the SACCOs, as the natural partners who should be providing this financing to the customers at scale. And, you know, this financing to be, for uptake to be high, it needs to be flexible, and it needs to have the appropriate payment modalities. And in terms of being flexible, you know, 2 points that really buttress, I think, points raised earlier is that, you know, number one, terms that we see from MFIs are sometimes more stringent than what developers can offer, because developers may sometimes be supported by grant funding to run this, so their tolerance, their risk tolerance is higher. So, you know, there is a role for development partners and governments to, you know, provide some guarantees to support MFIs to provide longer tenures and lower interest rates. And, you know, this is through de-risking. So how do they select, how do they quickly, efficiently, and using the least resources as possible, select the right end users who could qualify for this finance? And so, you know, here we see the role of development partners and governments in really providing support to provide this credit risk assessments without that intensity that requires an MFI to go out and investigate on a community level whether an individual is qualifies for financing or not. So, you know, I think just to summarize that point, those flexible financing terms really do lie on the de-risking of providing financing to the end user, and there's a clear role for development and government to enable that process to make it quick and less time intensive. And then on appropriate payment modalities, you know, here utilizing mobile money, smart meters, other technology platforms that are, you know, efficient and cost effective for the financier and also convenient for the consumer is also a fundamental element that underpins the feasibility of this financing. So yeah, in summary, we see it simply as three things that need to be in place in order to scale. That's the high performing machinery, the efficient supply chains, and then the flexible financing terms. So yes, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Wow. There's so much interesting stuff there that you were talking about. What I was particularly struck by is how we've been talking a lot about value chain assessments, and it sounds like quite a lot of the work that you've been doing about getting the right kind of machinery into these communities is about linking in with existing supply chains. You mentioned capitalizing on existing plant operators, existing people with existing machinery, supply chains, and actually utilizing those and piggybacking on those. It seems to make a lot of sense. And again, for me, it just conceptually widens the idea that some detailed analysis of value chains and supply chains is absolutely fundamental, whether you're looking at making market linkages for the agricultural output or whether you're looking at making market linkages for the machinery that will actually create that output. It's all part of the same kind of ecosystem. I find that fascinating. Another thing which really struck me is that you're talking a lot about the financial innovation and how do you provide credit risk assessments for some of these end users. And I love the idea of using local currency and also local systemic support networks for finance, like the SACCOs, like the informal savings groups in Kenya. I think that's a very innovative and interesting approach. Not least of all is because they understand some of the risks associated with running businesses in villages. But I think the thing that really, I think probably the headline fact for me is talking about the fact that a single mill in a village can have an 11% increase in the revenues for the mini-grid developer. I mean, that's an astounding figure, and shows that that's really a very interesting opportunity. And it strikes me that it's those kind of opportunities, those significant productive uses, if they can have such an impact on the viability of a mini-grid business model, that would be a really interesting thing to look at. And Kumbirai, I'm going to bring you in here because I know that the Rural Futures Fund has been looking at this and looking at how to crowd in commercial finance using the kind of potential for rural entrepreneurs. Perhaps you can talk a little bit more into that. Kumbirai, are you with that?
Thanks, yeah, thanks for the intro, Sam, and thanks to the rest of the speakers. So definitely there's a big opportunity when you really look at the rural entrepreneurs. I think that subset of customers are really an interesting subset that need to be explored. So when we sort of started with the Rural Futures Fund, I think one stat I read from my notes stuck with us. We looked at that there's 1.8 million, the mini-grid funders group found that 1.8 billion rather has been committed to the mini-grid sector, but only 13% of that has been dispersed. So that shows there's a fundamental mismatch problem between what the funders are looking for and what the opportunities on the ground. So there's really a big mismatch problem between the two. And we started looking deeper into that. And one thing we realized is that when you look at a mini-grid or look at financing a mini-grid, it's a really complex structure. So you have very different customer types. You sort of have your household users, and then you have, like Tombo was speaking about, the mill. You sort of have these rural entrepreneurs and these productive users who have a very different customer profile. So if you're able to look deeper into those characteristics, you sort of see that these groups are somewhat different, and possibly they can be funded differently. So that was the sort of the premise when we started looking at where the Rural Futures Fund can sit within this. So looking back at that, like Deepak mentioned, we started looking back at the data and where are these data sources. So we realized that every single mini-grid has a smart meter. This smart meter records how much energy demand is used and when payments are made. Additionally, we started looking with some of our partners with village analytics. We saw that there's really good on-ground data that you can get from geospatially about the characteristics of a village. Is a village growing? How far is it from a road? Is it close to a water body? That all of those factors were influencing the outcomes of the profitability and the outcomes of said connections. And finally, quite recently, we also started looking at the survey data that are done by the mini-grid developers, and we started seeing from that there's a good correlation. So that was the departure point, and where the Rural Futures Fund comes in. So the real concept behind this is really looking at, can we use this data that's already sitting there, that's existing, to sort of tranche and categorize these customers into different customer types, into different groups. And once you sort of have those groups, you can sort of refinance those groups. And sort of like, where does this all fit in? So I think you have to sort of look at it from a development-wide landscape. So what's currently happening is sort of you have developers, like you said, doing everything all the way down from finding their own finance to doing this. So you sort of have this equity that's used early on for developing the mini-grid, and then this sort of, which is typically quite expensive. And then you sort of have that same equity being used to finance, which is not best finance for long-term financing. But when you look at adjacent sectors like the IPP sector, you have specialists, you have your development companies, you have your EPC, you have your project owners, you have people that are playing really different type of roles, and then they also finance differently. Because at all these different stages, the financing needs are different, the nuances are different, and this calls for greater specialization along the route. So what the Rural Futures Fund comes is a sort of shaking of that, or borrowing from what happens in other sectors or the more mature infrastructure sectors, where you have local finance, construction finance, the same people that would help you fund a bridge. Those are the same people that would be best placed to help mini-grid developers put up their mini-grids. And then subsequently, you sort of have this patient capital that can then come in. And the key difference is where this patient capital can come in is that, as everyone sort of mentioned, the key theme there is data. At the development stage, there's very low data resolution. But once a mini-grid is operating, we start seeing all of these data streams there. And that can then be used to refinance it at a much, much cheaper rate. So why would a mini-grid developer go for this? And the simple answer is that it just makes financial sense from what we see. Because if you're able to sort of refinance at that stage, you potentially can reduce the weighted average cost of capital. But I think what the headline is the biggest benefit, I think, is being able to cycle that capital quickly. So as a mini-grid developer, you've gotten this expensive capital and you're sort of running it over 15 years before you can even recover it. But if you're able to refinance this, you're able to do what would take 15 years. You can cycle that capital in a year or 2 years. That ultimately accelerates the development of the mini-grid sector. So you're sort of moving the sector at magnitudes faster if you're able to have a mechanism to effectively refinance that. And when we talk about these entrepreneurs and why it's important to sort of segment them away, when looking at them, for them there's a massive benefit, because if they are isolated and being able to be funded separately, they effectively are put aside. So when you as us, rather, as the Rural Futures Fund, as we look to fund and finance these people, we are also likewise incentivized to grow their yield. So we've been looking closely to say how the characteristics of these users, because these users usually already have a high growth rate in the energy demand, but how can you accelerate that faster? So that's when we started looking at, as you mentioned, there's so many partners that can be put in that role. And if you sort of have these people that are looking at this specifically, there's a really good synergy that can be had with these local financial institutions that are really looking at supporting them. So when you do isolate these customers and you have a fund that is looking at supporting these customers, then naturally there's going to be that incentive to sort of connect them and to do that. And then finally, maybe when you talk about the last stakeholder there being the development institutions, why does it make sense? Why are you leaving everyone behind? I think one of the speakers spoke about efficiency of de-risking. So at the moment, you're sort of de-risking all of these customers. Everything is mashed up and there's no real clarity, or it's not really data-based how this de-risking is happening. So if you can sort of have a high resolution understanding of what this customer profile is, how are they best financed, then there's an opportunity then to sort of bring in different capital sources, de-risk more effectively. You can even go down to the dollar to say that this customer needs $10 subsidy a month, while the next customer needs 20, while these other entrepreneurs, we believe, can be funded exclusively through commercial capital. So being able to then go in that level or that resolution deeper, I think is a big opportunity. And me, at least speaking personally, what excites me most about the Rural Futures Fund is really the focus on the rural entrepreneur. There's a lot of mechanisms which are really innovative and great that look to support these entrepreneurs with sort of ideas and bringing concepts there. But I believe there's already a lot of great things that are happening that just need to be supported effectively. Looking at these grassroots of movements, looking at how these entrepreneurs can just be, given the wings to flourish. So I believe there's a lot of great talent that's there, that's just waiting to be powered, that's waiting to be given specific support. And the best ideas, I think, will come from the ground. And I'm excited about that. So thank you.
Thank you, Kumbirai. That's really interesting, and what a perfect summation of a lot of the threads that have been running through this webinar. As I understand it, the Rural Futures Fund is using data to disaggregate mini-grids level worth of connections and re-aggregate the productive users and put those into a fund. So we've got the kind of the data aspect, and it's using that tranching of the different types of customer in order to attract the right type of capital for the right purpose. So it's touching on using the right capital, the right source of funding for the right purpose. And I find that neatly kind of sums up quite a lot of what we've been talking about today. Ladies and gentlemen, we're running very close to the top of the hour. So I'm sure there will be some questions. And if you do have some questions, please put them into the chat box on the side of the screen, whether it's questions for a specific speaker or if it's questions more generally. We will get back to you on those, and just watch the LinkedIn's, the Smart Power SPM LinkedIn site for the answers to those questions. But in the interests of time, I'm going to bring the session to a close and ask Richard, perhaps you can give us some final words, please.
Well, thank you, everybody, very much indeed, to the participants for turning up today, to the fantastic speakers who've really I mean, honestly, it was just tremendous. The scope and scale of the different topics that we've been able to cover today. I think we could probably spend a few more hours on this for sure, and open it up to questions would be fantastic. The premise for this type of discussion was really the notion that in the past, the lion's share of financing and investment in this space has gone to supply expansion. I think Rocky Mountain several years ago put the number at something over 99%, with about 0.7% going to productive use or value chain investments in this space. That data is a little bit old. I don't know if somebody has upgraded that data or looked at the numbers a bit more closely, but the essence of that is the same, which is, are we, as we look forward to distributed rural electrification scale up, are we prepared for complementary investments in agriculture or other aspects of productive use, along with the scale up in supply? And that is obviously going to be a major challenge to financing institutions across the board. We know of quite a lot of financing that is currently being coalesced at different levels with different groups that is going to be pouring into this sector over the next 10 years. And the question is going to be, how is that financing going to be funneled effectively down through the spigot? And that is going to be a tremendous challenge when it comes to implementation at the ground level. And our speakers today have pointed out a few common themes that I think are exactly spot on and highly relevant in this context. We've heard Raluca talk about the complexity of market linkages, but also in some cases the realization that more investment was required to support market linkages than may have been initially expected. We've heard speakers talk about the different types of financing solutions that are required for different stages of the value chain. And that's incredibly important. Different types of money, different types of lenders, different types of financing solutions and terms, etc. Extremely important, supported by a deep understanding of the value chains themselves and the environments that the supply side investments are taking place in. And that's data analytics. It's better access to shared knowledge, shared data analytics, and these are piecemeal approaches that have been probably the mainstay of the last several years. I think there's a realization that this needs to come together in organized, holistic solutions. In terms of financing, I didn't invite myself, and Sam didn't invite me to be a speaker, but some of the financing examples that we've talked about today are reflected in Myanmar, where we've been doing a lot of experimentation around different types of financing vehicles. And just to throw in a couple of examples before we close that might be of interest to some of you. For consumers and connection financing and productive use, we've established something called the Energy Impact Fund, which deliberately focuses in on this problem of speeding up and catalyzing finance at the community level, using quite efficient and replicable governance systems in the community level to be able to work both with developers and with entrepreneurs on the ground, and that's been quite successful. But we've also looked at, and we've also helped develop an equipment financing facility to solve the problem that developers have with cash flow financing. And picking up on one of the comments made by one of the speakers about the need for, I think it was Deepak who was talking about the need for hand-holding of lenders. That's exactly what we did. We did risk training for commercial bankers who had only really experience in real estate. And suddenly they were very engaged in energy. And despite all the problems we face in the country that I'm focused on, those schemes are still functioning amazingly. But also guarantees. We've also helped to structure guarantees for last mile connection financing as well. And that's incredibly interesting because if that can work in extremely difficult environments, they can work in other countries as well. And I'm sure many of you are experimenting with those too. So these are lessons that we'll be sharing in the future. But for now, this is the end of our 3 event series on energizing agriculture in the Global South. And again, thank you very much indeed to everybody who joined us. And as Sam said, we will be responding to questions that are asked through the chat. And do encourage you to get in touch via email if you want further information around the study, or indeed anything from Sam or I that can be of use. So thanks again to the speakers, and have a very good day to everyone else.